People think peace comes from having a forgiving heart. They think if you keep swallowing your hurt, if you keep making excuses for people, if you keep saying they didn't mean it that way, then one day your home will feel lighter and your soul will feel clean. But that was never the real problem. At 80 years old, I can tell you that what nearly broke me was not anger. It was the habit of teaching everyone around me that I would survive any disrespect they handed me. I learned that too late, and I paid for it with years of my life. When I was younger, forgiveness was treated like a virtue in my family, almost like table manners. You forgave quickly, quietly, and without making anyone uncomfortable. You did not drag pain through the house. You did not ask people to sit down and account for what they had done. You smoothed things over. You kept birthdays pleasant. You made the casserole. You answered the phone in a normal voice. And if something inside you stayed sore for years, well, that was your private business. I became very good at that kind of living. I was a wife for 43 years, a mother long before I understood myself, a caregiver to my own mother when her legs gave out, and the sort of woman people described as strong because I did not collapse in public. That word followed me my whole life. Strong. It sounds like respect, but many times it is just permission for others to lean harder on you. People see that you can carry weight, so they stop asking whether you should have to. I did not understand that at the time. My husband was not a cruel man in the way people usually mean it. He did not come home drunk and smash dishes. He worked, he paid bills, and he could be charming to neighbors in the driveway. But inside the house, he had a way of making my labor disappear. A clean kitchen was normal. Ironed shirts were expected. A hot meal was simply what appeared at 6 o'clock. If I was tired, I would overreact. If I was hurt, I was sensitive. If I tried to explain why something mattered to me, he would sigh the way a person sighs at bad weather, as if my feelings were inconvenient but unavoidable. And every time I forgave him. Not because he always apologized. Most times he did not. I forgave him because I wanted the evening to move on. I wanted the children to sleep in peace. I wanted Sunday to feel normal. I wanted to believe I was choosing love over pride. That is how women like me were taught to frame it. But there is a line between forgiveness and self-erasure, and I crossed it so many times I wore a path through my own dignity. Then the children grew up, as children do. They left with all the urgency young people have when they still believe life is waiting somewhere else. I do not blame them for that. A young person should go. A young person should build, but children do not always notice what they are leaving behind. They do not see the mother standing in a kitchen that has gone too quiet, touching the rim of a chipped plate, and realizing that usefulness has been the language of her love for so long, that she no longer knows who she is without somebody needing something. After my husband died, the house changed its sound. Grief has a sound, though nobody tells you that. It is the refrigerator motor at midnight. It is 1 cup in the sink instead of 4. It is a front door that stays closed all afternoon. It is a chair by the window that becomes less like furniture and more like a witness. People came by a lot at first. They brought cakes I did not want and flowers that opened too wide in warm rooms. They told me to call if I needed anything. Most of them meant it in the shallow way people mean things when death is fresh and frightening. I forgave that too. My son called every few days in the beginning, then once a week, then when he remembered. My daughter was kinder with words, but kindness is not always presence. She would say, "Mom, you know I've just been so busy," in the careful tone people use when they are asking to be excused before you have even spoken. I would tell her it was fine. I always said it was fine. That was my specialty, making abandonment comfortable for the people doing it. One winter afternoon, I slipped on the back step carrying groceries. I did not fall hard enough to break anything, but I sat there on the cold concrete longer than I should have, one hand on the railing. A bag of onions tipped over beside me, because I was struck by a thought so plain and so ugly that I could not look away from it. If I stayed there another hour, who would know? Not because nobody loved me. That is too simple. They loved me in the abstract. They loved me in theory. But I had made myself so easy to postpone, so unlikely to complain, that my absence would first be registered as silence, not alarm. That was not even the part that hurt most. The part that hurt most came 2 weeks later at my daughter's house. She had invited me for Sunday lunch. I wore my blue cardigan, the soft one with the missing button near the waist, and I brought a pie I should not have spent the morning making because my hip was bothering me. I remember the smell of roast chicken and lemon dish soap in her kitchen. I remember little shoes by the door and crayons under the table, ordinary family details, the kind that should make a woman feel she belongs. I was sitting at the table with my grandson while he pushed peas around his plate. My daughter and her husband were talking near the counter, not whispering exactly, but using those lowered voices people use when they think they are being discreet. He said, "We need to figure something out before there's an emergency." My daughter said, "I know." Then he said, "Your brother won't do half of it. You know that." And then came the sentence that changed something in me. She can't stay alone forever. She's not really managing. I still remember the way my fingers tightened around the fork, not because I was confused, because I was clear. I had paid my bills on time, kept my house, cooked my food, walked to the mailbox every morning, remembered birthdays better than they did, but in their minds my quiet had become decline. My gentleness had become incapacity. My reluctance to burden them had become evidence that I was ready to be managed. I could have stood up then. I could have said, "I am sitting right here." I could have made them look at me, properly look at me, not as a problem to solve, but as the woman who had carried them through fever nights and school mornings and broken hearts. But do you know what I did? I forgave them before they even finished the conversation. I sat there and cut my pie smaller than necessary and smiled at my grandson and acted as though I had heard nothing. That old reflex was faster than thought. Smooth it over. Keep the day nice. Do not make people uncomfortable. And for the rest of the afternoon, I played my role so well that even I almost believed it. But on the drive home, with dusk coming down and the streetlights turning on one by one, I felt something in me harden, not into bitterness, but into recognition. I saw my whole life in one line, every insult renamed as stress, every neglect renamed as busyness, every dismissal renamed as misunderstanding. I had not been preserving peace. I had been protecting other people from the consequences of how they treated me. And once I saw that, I could not unsee it. That evening I put the pie plate in the sink, hung my cardigan over the chair, and sat in the kitchen with the light over the stove turned off. The room was dim except for the lamp near the calendar. I could hear the clock tick and a dog barking somewhere down the block. I sat there long enough for the tea to go cold in my hands, and for the first time in my life I asked myself a question I should have asked 30 years earlier. What if forgiveness had become the way I abandoned myself? What if forgiveness had become the way I abandoned myself? That question did not make me feel noble. It made me feel ashamed. Not ashamed of being kind. Kindness was never the mistake. The mistake was that I had handed out absolution where honesty was required. I had used forgiveness the way some people use a rug. Throw it over the stain, straighten the edges, and tell yourself the room still looks respectable, but the stain remains under there, darkening with time, and by the end of my life I had a whole house full of carefully covered pain. The next morning I woke before sunrise, which happens more often at my age than sleep experts like to admit. Older bodies do not always rest when you ask them to. I put on my slippers, wrapped that same blue cardigan around my shoulders, and stood in the kitchen waiting for the kettle to hiss. The window over the sink was black except for the faint reflection of my own face. I looked older than I felt inside and more tired than I had allowed myself to notice. That is one of the strange things about getting old. You can ignore yourself for years and then suddenly meet your own face as if it belongs to someone who has been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad I usually kept for grocery lists. Milk, bread, soap, stamps, practical little things. That morning, instead of writing errands, I wrote down names. My husband's name first, then my son's, then my daughter's, then my younger sister's, then 2 church friends. Then, after a pause, my own. I stared at that list a long time. My hand trembled a little, not from fear exactly, but from how plain it all was going to look once I forced it onto paper. Next to each name, I wrote what I had forgiven. Not the dramatic things, the ordinary things. Those are the ones that shape a life. My husband mocking me in front of company and calling it teasing. My son forgetting promises and speaking to me as if I were one more item in a crowded week. my daughter making decisions about me before speaking to me, my sister borrowing money and later describing it as though I had offered it joyfully, a church friend repeating something I had confided in her and then acting wounded when I withdrew, and next to my own name I wrote something that stopped me cold, teaching people I could live on crumbs. I did not understand how much that sentence would matter. I only knew it was true. That little notepad became a mirror. I saw patterns where before I had seen separate incidents. I saw how often I had rushed to excuse behavior that should have been named. I saw how often I called myself understanding when I was really frightened. Frightened that if I stopped smoothing things over, I would be left alone. Frightened that boundaries would cost me love. Frightened that at my age I no longer had enough time to rebuild anything, so I had better preserve what relationships I had, even if preserving them meant shrinking inside them. That fear had guided more of my life than I cared to admit. A week later, my son called and said, "Sorry, I've been hard to reach. Work's been crazy." It was said lightly, the way people toss a coat onto a chair. He expected me to say what I always said, "That's all right, honey. I know you're busy." I could hear traffic on his end and a turn signal clicking. He was driving somewhere more important than this conversation. For a second, my old self rose right on schedule, ready to comfort him for neglecting me. Instead, I said, "No, it isn't all right." There was a pause so sharp I could hear it. He said, "What?" I kept my voice calm. I had no interest in performing injury. "It isn't all right that you disappear for days after saying you'll call. It isn't all right that I have to pretend it does not hurt just to make this easier for you." He laughed once, not kindly, more from disbelief. "Mom, come on, I'm doing my best." There it was, that sentence I had protected people with for decades. I'm doing my best, as if effort erased impact, as if intention tucked the wound neatly closed. And for the first time, I did not rush to help him out of the discomfort. I said, "Your best may be all you have, but that does not mean I have to call neglect by a prettier name." I thought my heart would pound through my blouse. I truly did. But after I said it, I felt something unexpected. Space, air. The room did not collapse. The ceiling did not crack. I had spent so many years fearing truth as though it were a weapon that I forgot it can also be a door. He became defensive. Of course he did. "People who benefit from your silence rarely thank you for finding your voice." He told me I was being unfair. He listed errands, deadlines, obligations, the children's schedules, the price of everything, the exhaustion of modern life. I listened. Then I said, "I am not asking to be the center of your day. I am asking not to be treated as the leftover corner of it." He did not know what to do with that. Neither did I, if I am honest. The conversation ended awkwardly. No neat resolution, no warm apology. After I hung up, I sat at the edge of my bed and shook so hard I had to press my hands between my knees. That is the part people do not talk about when they praise boundaries. Setting one does not always make you feel powerful. Sometimes it makes you feel like a child who has just done something dangerous. But then I noticed something worse. I noticed how familiar that fear was, not because speaking up was wrong, but because I had been trained so well to confuse peace with obedience. That training started long before marriage. My mother was a tired woman with beautiful hands and no softness left by the time I was old enough to understand her. She loved through duty. She cooked, scrubbed, mended, stood, carried, bent, lifted, and endured. If she was disappointed, it came out as silence. If she was angry, it came out as sharp emotions, not words. I remember once, I must have been 12, watching her wipe down the kitchen table after everyone had finished eating. The plates were stacked, the men were in the front room, and she was moving a damp cloth in slow circles over crumbs nobody else even saw. I asked her why she never sat down until the very end. She said, "Because if you wait for people to notice what you do, you'll die waiting." I thought it was wisdom. I carried it like a family recipe. Only much later did I understand it was also surrender. She was teaching me survival as she knew it. I do not judge her for that. Women passed down what kept them standing, even when it also kept them small. But by 80, I had begun to understand that surviving on invisibility leaves a mark on the soul. If nobody has to notice you, eventually they do not. And the tragedy is that you begin helping them with that. My daughter called 3 days after my conversation with my son. She wanted to know whether I could come over Friday to watch the children because her usual arrangement had fallen through. Her tone was sweet in that organized way competent women speak when they have already placed you in the plan. I said, not this Friday. She sounded surprised. Oh, do you have something going on? I almost said no. The old impulse again, to justify myself, to provide acceptable reasons, to prove I was not withholding out of spite. Then I caught myself. A woman can lose whole decades explaining simple decisions to people who have never once explained theirs to her. So I said, yes, I do. The truth was, all I had planned was a haircut and a walk through the small market near the post office. I intended to buy tomatoes, maybe fresh bread, and come home before the afternoon cooled. Nothing grand, nothing anyone would call important. But that day became important because it belonged to me before it belonged to someone else. My daughter said, can't you move it? There was no meanness in her voice. That almost made it harder. People can diminish you without malice. They can do it with perfectly decent manners. They can do it while loving you. That is what makes it so easy to excuse. I said, no. Another pause. Then she said, okay, I'll figure something out. When I hung up, I cried, quietly with my hand over my mouth the way I used to cry when the children were sleeping, not because I regretted saying no, because I realized how foreign it felt to protect even one ordinary afternoon of my own life. That was when I understood something I wish I had learned 30 years earlier. Peace does not come from being endlessly available. It comes from knowing your life is still your life, even when the world has grown used to entering it without knocking. That Friday I did get my hair cut. I walked through the market slowly, one hand on the cart, smelling oranges and coffee from the little stand in the corner. I bought flowers I did not need, yellow ones in a cheap paper sleeve. At the register, the young cashier smiled and said, these are pretty special occasion. I almost laughed. I said yes, and for the first time I meant something larger than she could have guessed. I brought those flowers home and put them in the blue glass pitcher I usually saved for iced tea in summer. They leaned a little to one side, imperfect and cheerful, on the middle of my kitchen table. Sunlight was coming in through the back window in a pale stripe, catching the dust I had missed on the chair legs. I stood there longer than necessary, just looking at those flowers, and I felt foolish for how much they moved me, not because they were beautiful, because they were evidence that I had done one small thing without asking permission from guilt. That evening my daughter texted, hope you enjoyed your day. The words looked harmless on the screen. Maybe they were harmless, but I had lived long enough to hear the undertone in certain polite sentences. Enjoy your day, as if I had briefly stepped out of my assigned station and now needed to be acknowledged like a schoolgirl who had been granted free time. I set the phone face down on the table and did not answer right away. That was another new practice for me. Not every message deserved immediate access to my nerves. I made myself a proper supper instead of picking at crackers over the sink. Eggs, toast, sliced tomatoes with salt. I set a placemat down. I sat in the chair instead of drifting around the kitchen like a helper in my own life. That sounds like nothing if you have never disappeared inside your own routines. But when a person has spent years treating herself as secondary, sitting down properly becomes a kind of declaration. I began making small changes after that, and the world inside my house responded before the world outside it did. I stopped apologizing for not picking up the phone on the first ring. I stopped saying it's no trouble when something was trouble. I stopped lending my energy to conversations that left me feeling rubbed thin and vaguely ashamed. I started making my bed every morning, not because anyone would see it, but because an unmade bed has a way of telling an older person that the day does not really require her. I opened the curtains as soon as I rose. I put on a decent blouse even if I was staying home. I wrote down one useful thing I had done each evening on that same grocery notepad. Washed the sheets, walked 3 blocks, paid the electric bill, repaired the loose button on my cardigan, took soup to Mrs. Calder next door, read 20 pages. Those little lines did something to me. They returned shape to days that had begun to blur. I did not understand that at first. I thought I was simply organizing myself. But what I was really doing was refusing the quiet collapse that can happen when older people are treated as if they are already halfway gone. Usefulness is not everything. I know that now. A person has worth even in stillness. but purposeful action can steady the mind when the heart is learning a new way to stand. Mrs. Calder became part of that without either of us planning it. She lived alone in the yellow house next to mine, 2 years younger than me and twice as suspicious of everyone. Her husband had died before mine, and she had the guarded manner of someone who had spent too long answering the door only when necessary. We had always been neighborly in the narrow old-fashioned sense, a wave, a few words about weather, occasional tomatoes from the garden in summer. One rainy Tuesday I made too much lentil soup and stood at my stove debating whether to put the extra in the freezer. Then I thought of her. I ladled some into a container, wrapped a towel around it, and carried it next door under an umbrella that turned useless in the wind. When she opened the door, she looked at the container, then at me, as if I had arrived with a surprising piece of news. "What's this for?" she asked. I said, "Because I made too much." She took it but did not smile. "You didn't have to. There are sentences women our age have been saying our whole lives that really mean I do not know how to receive care without owing for it." I said, "I know." That answer softened something in her face. "Not much, just enough." A few days later, I found a paper bag hanging from my doorknob with 3 apples and a note in careful block letters, too many from my sister's tree, that made me laugh out loud in my hallway. 2 old women passing decency back and forth disguised as excess. That is how some bonds begin when people have been lonely too long, not with confessions, with soup, with apples, with reasons that pretend not to be reasons. By the second week, we were sharing coffee on Thursdays. Nothing formal. She came over in house shoes, and I put out 2 cups and whatever biscuits I had. We did not talk about deep things right away. We talked about roof repairs, rising prices, a young couple down the street who slammed their car doors as if punishing the neighborhood. But then one afternoon, while stirring sugar into her coffee, she said, "My daughter still thinks I don't notice when she talks about me in front of me." I looked up. She kept her eyes on the spoon, as if old age took my hearing and my pride in one sweep. I said, "Mine does it too." And there it was, that small human opening. Not sweet, not dramatic, just true. We started saying things plainly after that, about being managed, about children who loved us but rushed past us, about how easy it is to become a committee topic in your own family if you are polite enough for long enough. Mrs. Calder had a hard edge I admired. She said, "They all want us safe. What they really mean is quiet." I would not have said it that sharply myself, but I knew exactly what she meant. What happened next changed the way I saw everything. One Saturday, my grandson came by alone. He was 16, all shoulders and distracted energy, carrying a grocery bag because his mother had asked him to drop off a few things, bread, bananas, a carton of milk, as if I were a satellite household kept in mild orbit around the main family. He stood in my kitchen, glancing at his phone between sentences, and asked, "Grandma, are you okay here by yourself?" It was not a rude question. It was a question borrowed from adults, a question placed into his mouth by the atmosphere around me. I almost gave him the standard answer, "Of course, sweetheart," but I had begun to notice how much harm lives inside easy answers, so I said, "I am alone sometimes. I am not helpless." He looked at me then, properly looked at me. I pointed to the pitcher of flowers, now replaced by branches with early buds from the yard. I pointed to the list by the phone, my errands for Monday. I pointed to the soup cooling on the stove. "There's a difference," he nodded slowly. "Teenagers pretend not to be listening when they are often listening harder than anyone." He put his phone in his pocket and sat down at the table. After a minute he said, "Mom worries." I said, "I know. Worry can still be disrespectful if it forgets to ask the person living the life." He frowned in thought, the way his mother did when she was young. Then he asked, "So what are people supposed to do?" That question settled into me more deeply than he knew, not because it was clever, because it was honest. I said, "They are supposed to help without taking over. They are supposed to ask before deciding. They are supposed to remember that growing old does not turn a person into furniture." He let out a short laugh at that, surprised, and then he stayed for soup. We ate at the table while rain tapped the window screen, and for the first time in a long while I did not feel like a delicate relative being checked on. I felt like myself, an older woman in her own kitchen saying what she meant, feeding someone who was old enough to hear it. When he left, he hugged me harder than usual. At the door, he said, "You should tell Mom that." I said, "I think I just started." That night, I wrote in my notepad, spoke clearly, fed someone, felt like a person again, and for once that did not sound too small. It sounded like the beginning of something I had nearly missed. And it was the beginning, not a miracle, not a grand reinvention. At 80, life does not suddenly turn bright and cinematic because you tell one truth after a lifetime of swallowing 10, but something steady began to change. I became more careful with where I placed my forgiveness. That was the real shift. I did not stop forgiving because I wanted to become hard. I stopped offering it automatically, cheaply, before honesty had even entered the room. For most of my life, I believed forgiveness was proof of character. Now, I think timing matters just as much as mercy. When forgiveness comes too early, before the truth is spoken, before the wound is acknowledged, before the pattern is named, it does not heal anything. It only makes the injured person easier to injure again. A few days after my grandson's visit, my daughter came over. She did not call first. She knocked twice and let herself in with the extra key, which used to feel normal to me and now felt like a sentence missing its manners. I was in the hallway folding clean towels. The house smelled faintly of starch and the chicken I had roasting for supper. She looked tired, beautiful in the worn-out way middle-aged women often do, carrying too much in a body that has learned not to complain. She stood there for a second and said, "Ben told me what you said." I folded one more towel before answering. "What part?" she sighed. "About not being helpless, about people asking before deciding things." I nodded and carried the towels to the linen closet. I did not rescue her from the discomfort by smiling too soon. That was another thing I had stopped doing. She followed me into the kitchen. "Mom, we're just trying to make sure you're okay." There it was again. Care wrapped around control so neatly you almost feel rude separating them. I said, "I know you are trying to help, but help that does not respect the person it is helping becomes something else." She crossed her arms then, not hostile, but bracing herself. "You're acting like we're doing something terrible." "No," I said. "I'm acting like I'm still here." That landed. I could see it land. The room got quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint crackle from the oven. She looked at the table, at the flowers, at my notepad by the fruit bowl, at the pan soaking in the sink, evidence of a life, not a waiting room. And then, very softly, she said something I had not expected. "I didn't realize you felt that way. When you are young, you think that sentence fixes more than it does. At my age, I hear both the comfort and the limit in it. Sometimes people truly do not realize. And sometimes they do not realize because your silence has made their convenience feel harmless." I was responsible for part of that, and admitting it gave me a strange kind of peace. So I said, "I know I helped create that impression." She looked up surprised. "What do you mean?" I pulled out a chair and sat down. "I mean, I have spent years telling everyone I'm fine when I wasn't, years acting grateful for scraps because I was afraid of being difficult, years forgiving things too quickly because I wanted the family to stay smooth. That did not teach you how to love me well. It taught you how little would be required." She sat down too after that, slowly, like a woman no longer having the conversation she thought she came for. We talked for a long time, longer than we had in years without errands wrapped around it. There were no grand confessions, no music swelling in the background, just a mother and daughter at a kitchen table with afternoon light moving across the floor and the smell of chicken growing stronger in the oven, saying true things in ordinary voices. She admitted she had been scared, scared of an emergency, scared of failing me, scared of becoming responsible for one more thing when she already felt stretched thin. And under all that, there was something else. She had started seeing me the way the world sees old people, fragile first, full human second, not because she did not love me, but because fear makes people reduce what they are afraid to lose. I understood that. I really did. That is why this was not about punishment. I told her, "You are allowed to worry. You are not allowed to erase me while worrying." She cried then, not dramatically, just quiet tears she kept wiping away with the side of her hand, embarrassed by them. I did not rush to comfort her out of what she was hearing. That was important too. Letting other people sit in truth is not cruelty. It is respect. After that conversation, things did not become perfect. I want to be honest about that. My son did not suddenly transform into a thoughtful man with spare time and excellent emotional instincts. My daughter still slipped into managing tones now and then. I still had old reflexes. There were days I nearly said, "It's fine, just to get through a moment faster." There were days loneliness sat beside me in the chair by the window and would not leave until evening. But the difference was this: I stopped cooperating with my own diminishment. When my son called late and began with excuses, I listened and then said, "I'm glad you called. Next time, call when you say you will." No lecture, no apology for having needs. When my daughter started speaking about plans for me without me, I interrupted and said, "Ask me, don't arrange me." When church friends came fishing for private details disguised as concern, I gave them less. When I was hurt, I named the hurt before deciding whether forgiveness belonged there at all. That last part mattered more than anything, because forgiveness, I have learned, is not the same as access. You can forgive someone and still stop handing them the most tender parts of you. You can release bitterness without reopening the front door to the same muddy boots. You can wish someone well and still say, "No more of this." At 80, that distinction felt like finding clean water after years of drinking from the wrong well. Mrs. Calder noticed the change before anyone else. One Thursday over coffee, she looked at me across the steam of her cup and said, "You seem taller." I laughed. "I'm shrinking, if anything." "You know what I mean," she said. I did. There is a way a person occupies a room when she is no longer apologizing for existing in it. I had seen it in other women and mistaken it for personality. It is not personality, it is self-permission. The strangest thing was that peace came after I disappointed people a little. Not because I enjoyed disappointing them, I never did, but because peace was never hiding in their comfort. It was hiding in my honesty, in my mornings, in my small routines, in my own clear voice, in soup on the stove and curtains opened early, and shoes put on before sadness could talk me into another drifting day, in writing one useful thing down each evening, in giving care where it could be received and stepping back where it could not, in learning that I did not have to keep proving my goodness by how much hurt I could absorb without changing expression. That is what I wish more people understood before they reach my age. Some people should be forgiven, some people should be corrected, some people should be loved from farther away, and some situations do not require forgiveness first. They require a chair pulled up to the truth, a steady voice, and a plain sentence spoken without trembling if you can manage it, and despite trembling if you cannot. I am 80 years old now. I do not have the appetite I once had for false peace. I no longer confuse being needed with being valued. I no longer believe that staying quiet keeps love alive. Sometimes it only keeps disrespect comfortable. The peace I found was smaller than the kind people advertise, but stronger. It was not the peace of never feeling hurt. It was the peace of not betraying myself to keep the room pleasant. It was the peace of knowing that even now, even late, even after a lifetime of wrong habits dressed up as virtues, a person can still come back to herself. That is what I did. I came back to myself in a small house with a kitchen table, a blue pitcher, a notepad meant for groceries, and a voice I should have trusted sooner. And if you are listening to me now, still calling every wound understanding, still calling every insult stress, still forgiving people before they have even admitted what they did, then hear me carefully. Mercy is a beautiful thing, but mercy without self-respect is how some lives disappear. I know mine nearly did. And the day I stopped forgiving everyone was not the day I lost my softness. It was the day I finally stopped giving it away where it was not safe,